afternoon. Very much welcome to this public lecture by Marko Galeotti, co-organized by the Andrejaus Sacharovo Research Center on Democratic Development and the Adamkaus Library. Marko Galeotti is a Sovietologist, and you cannot imagine how happy I am when he told me this the day before yesterday, because usually when I go around and I tell people that I'm a Sovietologist, you get these kind of strange eyes and they think, well, it's something that you just invented. And so Mark is also a Sovietologist, and he's living proof that actually Sovietology is a science. Right?
Specialist of tea.
Yes. So Mark has been very active, in particular in security issues related to the Soviet Union, related to Russia, to this region. Has written a lot. This book is well known, I think, to you, Vory, the Russia super mafia. It's the basically the subject of what he will be talking about to us today. As I understand, there are 3 more books coming out next week. Next month. So in English. And so at the moment he is the principal director of the consultancy Mayak Intelligence. He is senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and both in the United Kingdom, and he is still connected to the Institute for International Relations in Prague. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here, Mark. And we'll be listening to you. By the way, the book can be found easily on Amazon.
I should mention, amongst the many translations that are coming, there's already an Estonian translation. No Lithuanian one yet.
Estonians, they always first.
I know, but you might say, so there is a market opportunity if there's any Lithuanian publisher out there. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here, not least because this is my very first time actually in Lithuania. So I'm very glad of the opportunity and the chance to talk about this my particular pet topic, organised crime and Putin's state. Which of course, it's not as though the links between the state and organised crime started with Putin. I think for me this is one of these sort of particularly compelling points. And it's worth teasing out precisely how it works. I remember once I was talking to a Russian police officer who was, I mean, like so many of his generation. I wouldn't necessarily say he was totally opposed to taking bribes, but he regretted it as a necessity of life. And it was interesting because precisely he was, for me, very much the kind of Russian police officer who is at a transitional point. He was not totally clean, but nor was he totally dirty. He had a sense of, shall I say, what were the acceptable levels of corruption and what were the unacceptable levels of corruption. And he also had an interesting kind of perspective on fighting organised crime, because he was in MUR, which is the Moscow Criminal Investigations Department of the police. And he said, look, he wanted to do his job. He wanted to fight the Mafia. But he also knew perfectly well that if he went after people at the real top of the criminal structures, he could spend a month, 6 months, a year working on building a proper case, something that can be taken to the prosecutors. And at some point while he was doing that, there would be a phone call from someone with a lot more gold on his shoulders saying, stop it, leave off. That investigation goes no further. And he would have to do that, to basically ditch the investigation or else suddenly find himself on traffic duty if he was lucky. But instead of therefore just giving up, what he therefore did was target middle-ranking gangsters. Not the small fry at the bottom, but not the ones at the top of the system who had their krisha, their roof, their protection, but someone who he at least felt he had a chance to catch and bring to court, and who, if they did go to court, it would make some difference. People trying to make the best of a situation in which the very state structure does not allow them to do their job. That, for me, was a nice metaphor for a Russia that is neither irredeemably corrupt, nor, at present, able properly to reform, but which has pressures both ways. And to a large extent, the reason for Russia being in that position is precisely because of the way that organised crime has evolved, to a large extent shaped by the state. There is this fashionable label of calling Russia a mafia state. And we understand why people use it. It's a nice, snappy term. It catches the eye. But I think it's problematic, because it implies one of two things. It implies either that the state runs organised crime, that on some level Putin tells the godfathers, do this, do that. Or it implies it's the other way around, that the gangsters can tell Putin what to do. Neither of them is true. What we have instead is a relationship. Not quite an alliance, but just simply powerful institutions, powerful blocks that are finding ways of working together. And that's what I want to unpick in this talk. And in a way, as I said, we shouldn't be surprised, because actually what we've seen from Russian history is the extent to which the upper world, the state structures, the formal economy, has basically shaped the underworld. The underworld is really just a distorted shadow of what we see. Now, without going back into Bazarism, you can read my book for that if you want. We knew that it happened, the relationship between bandits and Bolsheviks, right at the beginning of the Soviet era. The extent to which, when you look at, well, who did the Bolsheviks have to rely on in the countryside to be their enforcers and their agents, and often precisely it was rural bandits who realised, oh, this is a great opportunity to legitimise myself and turn myself from being an outsider into being an insider. Also, who did the Cheka, the secret police, turn to be its agents and enforcers in the cities? Well, to an extent, it was actually old Tsarist secret police assets, but again, it was also gangsters, because these were people who had skills that were useful, who had knowledge, who had contacts. Now, this was justified at the time as a necessity of civil war. The Bolsheviks were fighting for survival, and therefore they had to make certain moral and ideological shortcuts. But unfortunately, the shortcuts that were made during the Civil War, during the period of 1918-1921, actually would end up defining the whole Soviet era. The Civil War really defined the Soviet Union. So right from the beginning, you had a willingness to treat gangsters as potential allies, potential recruits. Then we would see this become even more of a factor with the gulags, with the rise of the gulag system under Stalin. There was this whole whirlwind of terror as a campaign that started essentially to destroy any potential opposition to the state. Not actual opposition, just people who might be. And obviously part of that was, for example, breaking the back of resistance to collectivization of farming in Ukraine, which meant that millions of people ended up being uprooted in that process. But generally, you had millions of people being sent to labour camps throughout the country, some of whom were criminals, some of whom were political enemies of the state, the overwhelming majority of whom were entirely innocent. They had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, were related to the wrong person, laughed at the wrong joke, or didn't laugh at the right joke, whatever it was. They were rounded up and sent to these gulags. But what started as an essentially political venture also increasingly became an economic one. The gulags were also seen as the engine for labour. Let's be perfectly honest, we're talking about slave labour, which was going to help modernise and industrialise this country. If you regard your prison system as first and foremost part of your economic structure, you obviously want to run it as efficiently, and that means economically, as possible. Now, think about where so many of the gulags were. They were scattered in the inaccessible, the high north, the wilds of Siberia and so forth. The places where most people did not want to live. Most people did not want to live sort of surrounded by clouds of mosquito in summer, freezing in winter. If you wanted people to go there by choice as part of their employment, you're going to have to pay them a lot. Well, that somewhat defeats the object of using slave labour. So, in what was a brilliant and inhuman act of economy, the Stalinist state hit upon a different way of actually running this network. They had prison guards, but actually they outsourced controlling these camps to trustees, to prisoners who were willing to work with the authorities. And so they needed to have convicts, zeki, who were actually willing to do the state's dirty work. Now, when it comes down to it, if you're going to choose a convict who is going to be your agent in the labour camps, are you going to pick a bespectacled 50-year-old professor? Or are you going to pick some thuggish, muscle-bound 24-year-old professional criminal who's there on 3 consecutive life terms for multiple murders? Well, sadly, I don't think I would have been making the grade. Of course, it was the professional criminals that the Stalinist state turned to. Firstly, because they were the tough, terrifying ones. Secondly, because ideologically, the Stalinist system regarded them as socially near, that was the phrase he used. In other words, these were just working class boys who had gone astray. It was the intellectuals, it was the politicals who were the real threat, the real danger. So they actually have found a way within their own ideology of rationalising this. That the gangsters just simply, they had false consciousness, they didn't quite understand what they were doing. But the third reason was they could tap into a very powerful criminal subculture that existed. One that actually does date back to the late 19th century, the so-called one of the Vorovskoy mir, the thieves' world, which was not an organisation, but it was a subculture. It was a group that had grown up within the rapidly industrialising cities of late Tsarism. And it was a criminal subculture that had its own code of behaviour, its own slang, its own visual language of tattoos, and above all, a key sense that they were separate from mainstream society. And let's just take the tattoos, for example. There are many other criminal subcultures that use tattoos. If you think like the Japanese Yakuza, for example, they affect these quite extraordinary, often deeply artistic sort of tattoos across their body with dragons and landscapes and wave and everything else. But the interesting thing is, their tattoos end mid-arm and around the neck. So that you can go into the bathhouse with your fellow Japanese gangsters and admire the other person's body art. But then you can put on a suit, or even just a shirt, and then you can blend in to mainstream society. That was not the way of Vory tattoos. There you would have finger tattoos that would show what particular criminal trades you practice. Often there are tattoos on the face. I mean, later on there'd be particularly one with barbed wire across the forehead, or symbols that showing sort of how many times you've been in prison. The whole point of Vory tattoos was not just simply to basically be a representation of your criminal career. They were also to physically mark you out as separate from mainstream society. The tattoos were there to say, I am not one of you. I'm a Vory. Fear me. And remember, this was the days before laser treatment to get your tattoos removed. This was meant to be an indelible lifetime commitment. And the Vory, they had this strong culture of separation. I mean, if you look at their language, I mean, in Vory dialect, slang, the word ljudi, people, only refers to other criminals. Now think about the implication of that. It means that people who are not criminals are not really people. There are other words for them. You can understand a lot about a subculture from the language it uses. Anyway, so here was this criminal subculture. From Stalin's point of view, they were tough, they were ruthless, they had sort of a code of commitment to promises made and so forth. There was just one problem. The traditional Vory code also said you never, ever cooperate with the authorities. At all. You never pay tax, you never do anything that mainstream society requires of you. That was a problem, but only a temporary one. The Stalinist state, in effect, offered all kinds of perks and benefits to those Vory who were willing to cooperate with the authorities. And remember, we're talking about gulag life, in which actually, a little bit more fat in your diet, the chance not to go out and cut down trees in the middle of winter or whatever, quite possibly was the difference between life and death. And also, the people who are in the Vorovskoye Mir were on the whole not pleasant people. A lot of them liked the idea of becoming a power within their camp. And so there were some who were seduced into working with the state. And they basically became the foremen, the enforcers, in some cases the guards, and later on in some cases you even had cases of criminals who were serving in a camp being made camp commandants later on. I mean, an extraordinary process of assimilation, but basically these people became absolutely integral elements of the management structure of Stalinist labour camps. And anyone who has read all the various harrowing Gulag memoirs, I spent, in the process of while I was working on this book, I spent about sort of a period of some months where I read nothing but Gulag memoirs. It was, as you can imagine, a very happy time of my life. But nonetheless, the memoirs are basically written by intellectuals, not members of the Vorovskoye Mir, but constantly this sort of the presence of these criminals who have been sort of adapted and adopted by the state is a sort of constant theme within them. Now, when these people began to cooperate with the authorities, they became, from the point of view of mainstream Vory society, outcasts. More, they became enemies. They had broken the code. And there were a lot of cases of violence and killing of these sort of so-called suki, the bitches, the collaborators, by the mainstream. But what happened was, in the period really of the 1930s, you had a kind of armed truce within the labour camps. The ones who had been co-opted by the state, the collaborators, they preyed on the mainstream camp population, the innocents who were there, and they forced them to work and so forth. They didn't try touching the Vory, the traditionalists. And likewise, the traditionalists, they may have despised the collaborators, but they knew that if they actually worked against them, the state would crack down on them. So they basically ignored the collaborators. And they too preyed on and exploited the ordinary prisoners. An uneasy truce that would not survive the Second World War. After all, for the Soviet Union, the Second World War was truly an existential struggle for survival. And in this time, you had cases of Vory, despite their claims to be totally outside, Vory who volunteered to serve in the ranks. More often, you had Vory who were forced to serve, being swept up and put into penal battalions and sent to the front. And obviously, at that point, as far as the traditionalists were concerned, they had become suki, because they had been willing to accept. The idea was, you were meant to, if necessary, die before you worked for the state. There were cases of traditionalists who would eat ground glass to stop themselves from being forced to go out to work. So basically, these people who've been willing to fight for their motherland, they were no longer part of the tradition. But also, at the end of the war, you had this grotesque spectacle whereby Soviet prisoners of war were freed from Nazi camps, under guard, marched onto trains and taken to filtration camps, and many of them then sent to gulags. Why? Because Soviet soldiers should never surrender. And also because they had had a chance to see what things were like in the West, and the fact that it wasn't like the propaganda presented itself as. So you also had a massive influx of ex-prisoners of war, the vieša, the soldiery, coming into the gulag camps. And again, because they had worn a uniform, because they had carried a rifle, as far as the Vory were concerned, they were people who were kind of collaborators with the state. So now suddenly, there were vastly more collaborators than there had been in the past. The old tradition whereby more or less the two groups pretended the other did not exist could not continue. And you have the explosion of a series, basically a rolling underground civil war within the Gulag system. One that will essentially destabilize the whole Gulag network, lead to a whole variety of risings in the camps in the late 40s and early 50s, which are increasingly going to make the whole Gulag system no longer profitable. And let's be perfectly honest, it would be nice to believe in humanitarian impulses, but the Gulag system was run down after Stalin's death, not because it was wrong, which it undoubtedly was, but because it was no longer paying. So, Stalin's heirs wind down the Gulag system and let out the prisoners. Of course, they let out the criminals before they let out the political prisoners. And you therefore have this explosion of violence that takes place across the Soviet Union, particularly in the areas where the camps were, places like, I was going to say Yekaterinburg, Sverdlovsk, and other areas, because you suddenly have all these violent, institutionalized sort of criminals suddenly now let loose on ordinary society. But the point is, in the process of the wars that took place in the Gulag, the collaborators basically wiped out the traditionalists. The state hadn't wanted this civil war to break out within the Vorovskoye Mir, but since it had broken out, they obviously wanted the collaborators to win. So they found all kinds of ways of basically helping them out, including things like making sure that collaborators got jobs in the camps as barbers and cooks. And you might think, well, so what about that? What that meant was access to sharp metal objects. So it's a kind of way of covertly arming the collaborators. And then they do other things, like they would move, the so-called etap system, which has people being moved around gulags. They would basically move a group of collaborators into one particular camp. There they would wipe out the traditionalists or force them to become collaborators. And then once their job was done, they'd move them like a military unit onto the next camp. Okay, increasingly methodical. So anyway, when the gulags are opened and the traditionalists destroyed, the collaborators come out, and over the next few years, again, there is another civil war, but another hidden civil war that takes place across the Soviet Union, as these collaborators basically bring their revised version of the code to the rest of the Soviet underworld. It's got all the kind of the unpleasant machismo of the old Vory, but with the new proviso, with the new clause, that it's okay to cooperate with the authorities if you're going to benefit from it. Not to be patriotic or anything, no. If you're going to gain from it, do whatever you want. And this is basically, by really the 1960, this has become dominant across the Soviet underworld. Now this is an interesting thing. We never really, as Western scholars, never really thought about organised crime in the Soviet Union. A couple of emigre writers had written about it, some very good books, particularly Charlidz's Criminal Russia. And they had essentially been patted on the head and then largely ignored. In the West, we had basically assumed that there could not be organised crime within a police state. Of course, we were wrong. In fact, organised crime could operate, but only as long as it accepts, as it were, the limits that the police state sets. Because this is also the same time when you have the increasing corruption of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union as a whole. Basically the ideology has become increasingly sort of threadbare, that people join the Communist Party just because it's the route to material prosperity and career success, and everybody has to operate on the black market as a way of getting goods and services that otherwise an increasingly inefficient system just cannot provide. And this is where organised crime came in. You have, in effect, an unholy trinity that emerged. The black marketeers, who sometimes they were involved in smuggling goods from the West, but they were also actually involved in producing goods within the Soviet Union. And often there were whole underground factories or wings of factories that were sort of off the books, but in practice working to fulfill the economic needs of Soviet citizens. These people had money, but they had no security. If someone robbed them, they couldn't go to the police. You know, excuse me, Mr. Militiaman, I have been stolen, I've had stolen from me 1 million rubles that I gained through speculation. No, no one could do that. So they had money but no security. Then you had the corrupt party elite. Now they had all sort of control over the instruments of the state. But what they often couldn't do is monetize that. Turn it into the kind of goods that they wanted. It's fine. So you run a state factory producing shoes. You can have as many shoes as you want, but how many shoes do you need? But maybe what you really want is a German record player. Or, a Skoda. Or whatever that you can't otherwise get. The black marketeers can get that for you. And you can provide them with a degree of security. The point is, could you ever actually deal directly with the black marketeers? And the answer is generally not. Organised crime emerged as the middleman, connective tissue between these worlds. At first they started to try and prey on the black marketeers. But then they realised how much easier was it just to make a deal. Say, look, you give us 10% of your profits and we'll protect you. And what point will you be? And also, we can be the person who can speak to the corrupt party bosses for you. And the corrupt party bosses, they can say, look, just make sure that, if we're in trouble, that you can call off the police or the KGB and protect us. And in return, we'll make sure the black marketeers provide you with the goodies. They emerged really as service providers to the others. And that was the role. It wasn't as gangsters, as we would think of them. It was as facilitators in the underworld. And that is basically what survived until the 1980s. Poor old Gorbachev. I can't help feeling sorry for someone whose reform programme, in hindsight, could scarcely have been designed more efficiently to benefit organised crime. Now think about it. The anti-alcohol campaign. Trying to separate Russians from booze. Seriously. But the point is, this was the interesting time, because all of a sudden, deprived of the chance to get the alcohol that they wanted, whether it's for celebrations or for oblivion, excuse me, this is when ordinary Soviet citizens increasingly started turning not just to the black market, but increasingly actually to organised crime. Because the demand for samagon, homebrew, or stolen official alcohol products, or smuggled in foreign stuff, totally outstripped what the black market could provide. And this is where organised crime came in. And I remember talking to a middle-ranking gangster who, in the early Gorbachev years, had been a shestyorka, a sort of low-level runner for the gangsters. And he said it was amazing, because they would go into these big, grimy apartment blocks on the outskirts of Moscow, and everyone was pleased to see them. Because we think of gangsters and we think of kind of exploitative, parasitic, dangerous people. But no, these are the guys who get you booze. These are the guys who can get you drink. And so everyone was happy to see them. Everyone wanted to put in an order. And increasingly they would say, well, look, if you can get us that, can you also get us this? Can you also get some medicines that my kid needs? Or, can you get me an appointment with a dentist? Or whatever. Do you know someone at City Hall who can get... All these things happen. And what happened is the first time that for most Russian citizens that they encountered organised crime, they encountered it actually in a positive way, as someone who can help you get past the day-to-day miseries of life in a collapsing Soviet Union. Then we had the cooperative movement, small-scale businesses that gave the suddenly rich gangsters the chance to launder that money. And we generally had the democratization campaign that led to the kind of collapse of the Soviet system, which meant that all of a sudden, all of these officials, who once upon a time had been the gods of their own little region, suddenly were thinking, I might have to win an election. A real election, ones with more than one candidate on the ballot. What I really need is someone who can make sure that people come out and vote for me. Someone who can make sure that the political rallies of my opponent get broken up. Someone who can make sure that none of my opponent's election leaflets get delivered. And this is, again, something the gangsters can provide. Russian gangsters have basically been the state's dirty little service provider. Whether it has been in terms of helping the Cheka and the Red Guard in the beginnings of the Civil War, whether it's in terms of essentially policing and running the Gulag system, whether it's in terms of facilitating the black market, which is absolutely essential. I mean, let's not forget, if there had been no black market, the Soviet Union's economy would have ground to a halt at least a decade earlier. The black market was essential to the survival of the Soviet economy, and the gangsters held that. And then later on, the gangsters were the people who could basically provide all kinds of benefits and services to this emerging post-Soviet, but essentially Soviet, new Russian elite that emerged. And in the 1990s, again, in some ways it was the state, not by its actions, but by its inactions, by the state's failure to properly reform in Russia, it created all these vacuums that the gangsters filled. I mean, in the 1990s, yes, the gangsters were involved in smuggling drugs and guns and protection rackets and all these other kinds of things, but they were also, for example, providing a whole variety of almost state-like functions. If someone owed you a debt in the 1990s, you could go to the courts, the totally corrupt courts that basically would just simply sell a decision. But it could take years. And the law was that you could only claim back what the original debt was. And in years, inflation would have eaten away at that money. Or you can turn to the gangsters, and they will basically make damn sure that you get your money. And maybe they'll take 10%, maybe they'll take 20%. But it was actually still economically worthwhile. As the state was failing in the 1990s, the gangsters could basically fill that void. I remember talking to a Western businessman who was involved in early stages of distributing consumer products, Western imported cheap consumer products, toiletries and such like around. And he was using a particular trucking firm. I said, you are aware that that firm is run by the Chechen Mafia? And he said, oh yeah, that's why I go for them. Why? Well, every other firm I used, almost everything got stolen. Either the drivers would steal it from the lorries, or gangsters would hold up the lorries when they're in the middle of the night, or when the lorry was parked up, people would break in and steal from it. Chechen trucking firm. No one messes with my stocks. It was actually economically wise for this person to do a deal with an organised crime, openly organised crime run trucking firm, simply because the state was in such a state of collapse. But then things change. Enter Putin. When Putin was kind of campaigning, 1999-2000, he obviously talked very tough on law and order. Presented himself as the man who's going to deal with all these problems and bring it to an end. And a lot of people, even within the underworld, thought he was going to be serious about that. I remember talking to one boy who literally had a packed suitcase under his bed, so that if he got a phone call from one of his informants in the police saying, we're going to be coming for you, he could grab that suitcase and rush for the airport and get out. Well, he never had to use that suitcase. It actually became very clear that as far as Putin was concerned, organised crime was not really a problem, not really a priority. Instead of cracking down on organised crime, what he did was basically offer organised crime a social contract, a deal. And it was this. You carry on doing your crimes, and the police are going to carry on trying to catch you. Fair enough. But if you do anything that looks like a challenge to the state, or an embarrassment to the state, we will treat you as an enemy of the state, which is something that is rather more serious. And frankly, after a decade in which they had made a lot of money, but also been fighting rolling turf wars and so forth, organised crime was actually quite willing to take that deal. Again, I remember talking to a captain in Vory, a police officer, who basically said most of 2000 he spent having sit-down meetings with gangsters around Moscow and just simply explaining the new rules of the game with them. You know, it was that explicit, it was that clear, saying, okay, this is what's now. And it happened. You had a very quick and dramatic change, which in part had been happening before. For example, in terms of contract killings, 2015, there were almost as many contract killings as there were in 1995. And we think of 2015 as a time of relative stability, and 1995 as a period of Bredel, so chaos. The thing was, in the 1990s, a lot of the contract killing was carried out very indiscriminately. It was the car bomb, or the drive-by machine gunning of a restaurant. Lots of innocents were under risk, and therefore everyone was scared. Since 2000, the standard etiquette of the contract killing, it's nice to know there's an etiquette for all things, like we said, as an Englishman, is that essentially the only targets are going to be the actual intended victim and his driver bodyguard. And these two people are going to get gunned down one night, and no one else is going to care. It's going to get maybe 2 column inches on page 6 of the local newspaper. No one's going to care. Why? Because basically the people who get gunned down were in that world anyway. People outsiders, maybe, unless you're a journalist who's trying to investigate into someone's sort of business too closely, I'm still amazed and impressed that there are real investigative journalists in Russia. Despite the fact that it is as dangerous to be an investigative journalist in Russia as to be a war correspondent in the rest of the world. I mean, literally. But nonetheless, people are still willing to do that. But the point is, nowadays, civilians don't feel at risk, and they're not at risk. Essentially, everything has got control, because Putin would not allow mayhem on the streets, because that made it look as if the state was not in control. It's all about the state. Now, every now and then, some gangster figures become a little bit too visible, a little bit too high profile, or they challenge the state, and then the state reminds people of who's in charge. A classic example actually was one of the key figures within the Tambovskaya group, that was from St. Petersburg, Kumarin Barsukov, he changed his name, who had been basically working as a businessman as well as a gangster, seemed to be untouchable. Until he made two mistakes really. One of just being too visible, too obvious, embarrassing to local boy Vladimir Putin. But at the same time as essentially not being willing to cut beneficial deals to people close to the Kremlin. That was being a bit cheeky. That was not appreciating who was in charge. 300 police commandos were sent from Moscow to St. Petersburg to arrest him. He was immediately airlifted out of St. Petersburg and back to Moscow and put in prison. And then in due course he was charged and imprisoned. Now, the Prosecutor General, Yuri Chaika, who is basically one of Putin's factotums, said that the reason they had to do it this way was they were concerned about corruption within the St. Petersburg police force and so forth. Well, that's true, but only part of the truth. The other reason for using so many men and making this such a big, high-profile, well-televised event was precisely to make a point. Precisely to say, you may think you're untouchable. You may have lots of guys with guns or whatever. But bear in mind, the state is still the biggest gang in town. Doesn't matter how big you are, we can take you down. Doesn't matter how many men with guns you've got, we've got more with bigger guns. So there is very much this case of the state demonstrating it. And in hindsight, we should not have been surprised. Because if you look at Putin's career in St. Petersburg in the 1990s, when he was deputy mayor. Again, it's fascinating to unpick now. One of his key roles was to be liaison, to make deals with whoever needed to have deals. And that included foreign companies, it included big business in St. Petersburg, but it also included gangsters, who were necessary, just if nothing else, just to ensure that they didn't get in the way of trying to run St. Petersburg. So in a way, what Putin did, was he took the model that he had tested out in St. Petersburg, and he rolled it out across the Russian Federation when he was president. And it's worth mentioning that Kumarin Barsukov was, after all, one of the figures with whom he had dealt with in St. Petersburg. He was willing to deal with him after a while, but as soon as it became an embarrassment, as soon as it became an inconvenience, as soon as it made it look as if somehow he was bigger than the state, he had to go. So this is what's happened. We have this new social contract, a new relationship, which to a large extent is defined by the state setting boundaries. Putin does not tell the gangsters what to do. Putin's state tells the gangsters what they cannot do. You can't do things that can embarrass the state. You can't mess with certain figures who are close to Putin. And sometimes it's really quite specific. I mean, it's fascinating with the Sochi Winter Olympics and the recent World Cup. It's very clear that, look, the Kremlin was very, very keen that these things went without a hitch and without any kind of bad publicity. And the word went out. These foreigners who are coming, they must not be dealt with badly. Sell them drugs if they want to buy drugs, sell them prostitutes if they want to buy, hire prostitutes or whatever. But we don't want burglaries, robbings, we just don't want any kind of bad instances. And the word went out, and indeed the gangsters held off. They realised that when the state tells them about something like this, it is not worth their while challenging that. So the first element of the social contract is for the state to set the boundaries. Second element of this social contract is, ironically, that you've got, once again, I think a separation of the different worlds of dirty business, dirty politics, and the underworld. In the 1990s, it was very hard to tell the difference. I mean, I spent some time working for the British Foreign Office, and occasionally I had people saying, so-and-so has applied for a visa. Are they organised crime? And I usually have to kind of live down to the stereotype woolly-minded academic by, instead of giving them the nice clear answer that they wanted, saying, well, it depends what you mean by organised crime. Because the people they were usually asking me about were not kind of tattooed thugs. They were kind of businessmen who had corrupt politicians in their pocket and probably made their first million from embezzlement, but it's hard to actually decide quite where they fit. Actually, we've now seen something of a more clear distribution. I mean, not that any of these people are honest, but that they have, as it were, different dishonesties. The gangsters do the gangster work. The dirty politicians provide protection, cretia, send contracts in the right direction in return for a suitable cut of the proceeds. The dirty businessmen, make sure they avoid their taxes, they get their contracts by being in bed with the politicians, and they may well turn to the gangsters if they need a journalist silenced, if they need traffic labour to build a hotel or whatever. But there's a very clear distinction, because Putin wanted to know with whom he was dealing. But the third element of the social contract is actually, I think, increasingly we've got the state moving from being essentially negative, this is what you can't do, to increasingly positive, this is what we want you to do. Now, we've seen that, for example, with hacking. Now there's obviously a lot of talk about the GRU, military intelligence being involved in hacking. But if one looks back, actually the majority of cases in which it looks like there were kind of computer attacks that were driven by the state, ranging from the attacks on Estonia in 2007 to more specific ones. Actually, they were criminal hackers who basically the FSB knew who they were, and at a certain point said, we know who you are, we can crack down on you, or you can do something that we need doing. That was a model that then became more generalised, and we particularly, I would suggest, have seen this since 2014. I call this in some publications kind of Putin's Kremintern. Russian organised crime, Russian-based organised crime, is uniquely global. I would stress this actually. I mean, they are not the biggest gangsters around. The Italians, I suppose my Italian half would be proud of that. Incidentally, named Galeotti means convicts, Zecchi. But you know, they are still the most powerful and richest. But the Russians are the most globalised. You'll find them everywhere, in one form or another, with some kind of connection with the global underworlds. And facing this new geopolitical struggle with the West, it's clear that Putin, aware that Russia economically is vastly weaker, militarily is weaker, in soft power is worlds weaker, is instead looking to mobilise whatever resources Russia does have, which Russia can actually use against the West, and one of them is gangsters. Now, I wouldn't want to overplay it. We only have got, I mean, even sort of most expansive definition, maybe a dozen cases. But we're increasingly seeing instances, I would say increasingly, where actually Russian-based organised crime is being used as an additional asset. It's not replacing the spies and all the other instruments. It's an addition to them. And sometimes it's because they've got particular skills. They can smuggle someone across borders, they can move goods indetectably. Sometimes it's just to provide extra support for intelligence operations. Most importantly, though, of all, it is actually the generation of черная касса money, black account monies. In other words, funds that don't seem to have any kind of Kremlin fingerprints on them. So, for example, we have got specific cases. I mean, one actually sort of relates to Estonia, when the Estonian security police officer Eston Kokver was kidnapped across the border. Well, he was investigating a cigarette smuggling ring. Doesn't seem to have any kind of particular security or intelligence dimension. However, in hindsight, it becomes clear that that cigarette smuggling ring was basically being allowed free access across the border by the Russian Federal Security Service, in return, firstly, for carrying out some low-level surveillance operations, but secondly, in return for a cut of their proceeds, of their profits, that was then being sent to various sort of bank accounts in Europe. So in other words, money that didn't seem to have any kind of, it hadn't come from a Kremlin bank, it hadn't come from Moscow, it wasn't in rubles. You know, it was generated within Europe by people who are very good at hiding their money. And I think this is actually where the Russians are increasingly getting their operational funds for particularly political operations in Europe. It's essentially by taxing Russian-based organised crime operations within Europe. And I've heard other examples in Bulgaria and elsewhere. So this is the connection. So I mean, to summarise, I mean, what we see is a state, Putin's state, that increasingly has begins to embody a sort of sense that, an ideological sense of mobilisation. It basically says, look, we are in an existential political struggle with the West. The West wants to constrain us. The West wants to deny us our rightful place as a great power. And therefore, we need to use every instrument at our disposal. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about the media. It doesn't matter if we're talking about oligarchs. It doesn't matter if we're talking about anything, including gangsters. They can be, if need be, conscripted to the state's service. Now, this presents a rather pessimistic perception. So let me just end with a little bit of room for optimism. It's like Pandora's box, and there's always be hope at the very bottom of it. I don't think that this model is going to last in the long term. It will basically last so long as Putin is in the Kremlin. But trust me, that will end. It just seems as if it never will. First of all, the Russian people themselves are fed up with this. I mean, this is why corruption is one of the issues that Putin is most worried about being used to mobilise opposition against him. People are well aware of the situation, and it's not just ordinary people who feel corrupt. As I said, going back to my example right at the beginning, there are a lot of people within the system, cops and such like, who want to do their job. And in some way, this is actually vaguely reminiscent of the situation that obtained in Italy in the 1970s, when everyone knew that the Mafia was in bed with the governing Christian Democrat Party, and you couldn't do anything about it. People were getting fed up, till eventually that kind of became too much, with the murders of two particular investigative magistrates created this national movement that forced a corrupt government to change. Now, okay, it's not going to happen quite that way because Russia is not a democracy in the way that Italy was. But nonetheless, there is a growing groundswell, in my opinion, of Russians who are fed up. The second reason is actually many people within the elite. I won't say they're fed up, but they want to move on to the next stage. When you're robbing banks, you don't want there to be a police force. By the time you own a bank, you want there to be a police force to look after your bank, so you don't have to hire private security guards. The current generation of the Russian elite is deeply corrupted, kleptocratic, but also getting older and wanting legitimacy and security. They want to feel that they can travel without their assets being sequestered. They want to feel that their kids can go abroad. But they also want to feel that they can step down and hand their resources onto their kids. We are soon going to have a massive transfer of resources from one generation to the next. The initial post-1991 rich are going to be stepping down, retiring. They want that kind of security. And for that, they need a law-based state. So this is the irony. Having stolen everything they possibly can, they now want law to protect what they've stolen. And the third and final element is the underworld itself is unstable. Putin's model only works as long as the underworld is pretty stable. You can basically cut deals and everyone is quite happy with the outcome. Now increasingly this is an unstable underworld. There are constantly new pressures, there are new sources of revenue. I mean, 1/3 of Afghan heroin now travels through Russia, a country with, after all, the highest heroin consumption per capita in the world. Most of it heading towards Europe, a little bit heading towards China. And gangs are beginning to kind of compete more openly for control of that. Sanctions are creating their own pressures. Ironically, the very stability of the underworld is a problem. Why? Not enough gangsters are being murdered. Now, that's not my opinion, I should stress that. But the point is, in the 1990s, if you were smart and ambitious and lucky, you could rise very quickly because basically the other gangsters were being murdered. Nowadays, you actually have relatively fewer cases of senior gangsters being assassinated. And so you've got a generation of 40-something gangsters saying, when's my turn? Why am I still being run by this 65-year-old or 70-year-old who's in charge of the gang? And actually you're beginning to find that also causing tensions and fractures. So for good reasons and bad, for both the fact of, I think, the Putin system is increasingly sitting uncomfortably with many Russians, and also the fact that actually the underworld itself, at some point, is not going to explode into a sort of truly global national turf war like in the 1990s, but is likely to face kind of local pressures like that. I don't think this current situation will continue. For the moment, this model of a kind of conscripted organised crime, which operates really within the boundaries that the Kremlin sets, is the pattern we have. Anyway, I'll stop there so we have time for questions, comments, furious rebuttals, or whatever.
I have two questions. How much time you predict Putin's regime will hold?
Yeah.
How much time you give?
Okay.
To your opinion, I have.
Well, that's one question. Give me the other one, and then
The other one, yes. The other one is why you work a lot in the UK. So the question is why the UK government is so soft on Russians' money, oligarchs' money. They know a lot about them, about transactions, property, and so on. They can do even after Skripal affair. They can do a lot to hurt very, very much Putin's regime. Why they are so soft on them? Why they do not much?
No,
We are both for everybody.
Okay, on the first one, I mean, look, I think personally that Putin is tired. I think he's tired of being president. Now, he's never going to just totally step down. And he's certainly never going to kind of join the international sort of ex-president circuit, doing charity galas and playing golf. But basically, I think he is actively looking for a successor. If he finds someone he feels he can trust, I think what we will see is he will very quickly elevate that person. And he'll also bring in a kind of constitutional amendment that gives him some new role, chairman of the state council or something, that gives him security and also the chance to intervene in politics if he wants to. But to be honest, I mean, I think that if Putin does have to sort of stand again or change the constitution so that he can run again in 2024, that would have been a result of failure. A failure to find a successor. So, I mean, I think we are genuinely in the closing years of Putinism, but I don't think it's going to happen next Wednesday. I mean, I think, you know, we have got up to 2024. And although Putin will choose his successor, I think in practice, we will see, you might say, the kleptocratic element of the regime asserting itself over the ideological. Because most members of the elite, they didn't sign up to fight some ideological crusade with the West. They just wanted to be able to steal at home and keep that money safely abroad. And that's what they want to bring it back to. And the depressing fact is, which kind of links into the second question, that won't be much fun for ordinary Russians, but it'll be fine for us in the West because we know how to deal with kleptocrats. We deal with kleptocrats all the time. And so you ask about Britain, and yes, on one level, Britain has a shameful record of accommodating rich, questionable Russians. But in a way, you answered the question as you asked it. Rich, questionable Russians and their huge amounts of money. I mean, this is a cynical, pragmatic move. We love rich foreigners. You know, this is a way. I mean, it's not just Britain, but I like to feel that Britain kind of rules the world in terms of sanctimonious pragmatism. But the thing is, I mean, I think I would love to see a much tougher line taken with these rich Russians with their questionable money. However, I think we should do that for its own reason, not because it's going to hurt Putin. The irony is, the more we crack down on these rich Russians and their money, the more we actually send them and their money back to Russia and make them more dependent upon Putin. So, I mean, I think the idea that this is somehow going to exert pressure on Putin. Putin doesn't care if some oligarch loses half his money, unless it's one of the few oligarchs who are his friends. But those people are already back in Russia. No, we should do that because we should not be facilitating criminals. You know, that is the most basic point. But you know, let's be perfectly honest. I mean, where are the great money launderers of the world? London, New York, Dubai, the great financial centres of the world. You know, as long as you've had the courtesy to pre-wash it somewhere else, as long as it's gone through Cyprus and Riga and Frankfurt, you know, by the time it gets to these other places, we will pretend that it's all clean money.
But
it's just cynical pragmatism.
Don't you think that there are some meanings that not meanings, but some theories maybe, yeah, that not the Putin is the most powerful person in this situation, and he is not the person who can be. There is a surroundings, some 10, maybe 5 people, they want him to be there, but not he rules all the things. Not he rules, we have no name to call, we name the Putin, regime Putin.
Yeah.
But if they want, they will not exist.
I just don't want to make sure that other people have time. I mean, but I take your point. I mean, but the point is, yes, there are those people around him who are very influential. However, I think it's clear that Putin is not their prisoner. Or rather, he is not their unwilling prisoner. I mean, Putin ultimately, you know, he is happy to look after his friends. And his friends, therefore, have considerable influence on him. I mean, I think this is going to be, this is being recorded, and I think it's going to go out on YouTube. So I won't mention any names, if you'll excuse me. But nonetheless, you know, we do know who these powerful figures who are actually also personal friends of Putin is. But again, he is not their prisoner. He is their willing protector. And I think that's the difference. Okay, I'll go over there.
What do you think? How much influence Putin has over the Republic of Lithuania at the moment? His circle, at least.
Sorry, influence Putin has
over this republic, the Republic of Lithuania.
Okay.
What do I mean? Like Prigozhin a few months ago, flying on the helicopter and landing here. I'm not far from Kaunas or Vilnius. I don't know that one of those ports to have this helicopter repaired. Like Prigozhin, yes, he is on the sanctions list.
Well, I mean, I think that in a way one has to kind of distinguish certain things. I mean, there is, like, shall we say, influence over a state at a kind of, you know, being able to tell a state what to do, or at least sort of, you know, dramatically change its policies. I don't see that as being the case. What I do see is clearly there are challenges for any one individual country, especially a smaller country, to be that tough with the Russians and that ruthless. This is one of the reasons why the Russians never like to deal with the European Union. I mean, in part it's because they don't really think the European Union exists. But it's also because the European Union as a bloc is more powerful than Russia. But most individual countries within the European Union are that much weaker, and therefore the Russians love to keep relations bilateral. Now, I think when it comes to Prigozhin, I mean, I can't sort of pretend to any kind of inside knowledge about that particular case. But I mean, I think generally speaking, it is more that there are certain situations in which a lot of countries are tempted to turn a blind eye to a specific point where you know that if you actually do anything about it, the Russians are going to respond very toughly. And I think this is because this is a problem we have about solidarity in Europe. We have NATO, which is, has a rock-solid guarantee against military aggression. If the Russian tank rolls across your border, I have no doubts, and interestingly enough, I think Moscow has no doubts, that NATO will be there. But anything short of that, actually we have seen a striking lack of solidarity within the European Union. Basically, you're on your own. And I think this is more likely to be the issue, in my opinion, again, purely my opinion, is actually just thought, look, things are going to get very, very sticky if we actually do anything about this. So it's just one case, let's just pass it by. But the third element, I think, I want to stress this. There's a lot of talk about disinformation and generally as this sort of terrible problem from the Russians. For me, the biggest problem is not disinformation, it is corruption. And that is where I think the Russians have got this kind of capacity to exert influence on specific issues. Not just specifically here, but I mean, I think, in any Western country. And I think that's where we need to consider more. Because the thing is, a lot of times, when we see sort of policies being adopted, they're the result of extensive, open conversation. But when we see specific actions, for example, are we going to do anything about Prigozhin? Now, I don't know if it's in part because actually decision-making was slowed by any individual. Anyone sort of sat on it until it was too late or whatever. Corruption is the kind of the magic ingredient that you can use in all kinds of different circumstances, and that's something that the Russians excel at. So, on a state policy level, I don't see it. Capacity to actually influence through intimidation, through corruption on specific cases, sadly that's not impossible.
To touch on a little bit earlier, you spoke about smuggling into different countries, and you just expressed your opinion on Russia's influence within Lithuania currently. Do you see an influence of smuggling that's being Russian-led into Lithuania? And if so, to kind of tie into another point, you talked about the stagnation of age. Mm-hmm. What demographic do you see those smugglers being? Are they those older people who would like to move up, or are they lower level, maybe 18 to 30?
Well, interestingly enough, first of all, to answer that last bit, the smugglers are often not Russians. Russian organised crime, like most organised crime, is strikingly international. And just as one can look at the very, very close links that are existing between Russian and Ukrainian smugglers, even while their countries are in undeclared war, well, so too one can also see it in the Baltic states. I mean, the cigarette smugglers that Eston Kokver was looking at were largely Estonians, not Russians. So let's not assume that it's actually going to be Russians who are doing the smuggling. And in age terms, yeah, I mean, smuggling is generally a sort of a younger guy's kind of job. It's basically usually late 20s onwards, late 30s. In terms of smuggling, I'd say Lithuania, what's interesting is actually the Belarus angle. Because we know that Belarus is used as a sort of cutout for all kinds of trades back and forth. So we have, for example, luxury goods that are under sanction in Russia, counter-sanctions, are smuggled in. Well, either that or else the Belarusians suddenly have acquired an astonishing appetite for parmesan and so forth. But no, it's clearly not. There's a lot of sort of smuggling through. So there's smuggling that goes that way. And then there's smuggling out, actually, it's effectively money. We're seeing a certain amount of money laundering, not the kind of big industrial money launderers that we've seen elsewhere, where you have millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions being laundered. but lots and lots of individual people's bank accounts have been used to sort of, you know, to launder maybe €1,000 a month, stuff which is always going to be beneath the reporting guidelines. But if you've got 50 people doing that, then you begin to have a sort of, you know, an interesting activity. So we've got, in a way, money smuggling through the form of money laundering. We have luxury goods smuggling into Belarus. We also have smuggling of stolen items, organised theft rings in Europe, which then, you know, one of the ways is they move it through Lithuania. But there's also one of the key problems, though, is there's actually some quite, and I hesitate to sound as if I'm praising them, but quite efficient Lithuanian organised crime groupings that are operating in Europe. And one of the problems sometimes is distinguishing those which are purely Lithuanian and those which are ethnically Lithuanian but linked to Russian gangs. And I was talking to some people at Europol quite recently, and that was something that they didn't have a definite answer on. But on the whole, I mean, I don't see Lithuania as being a major smuggling route. Actually, if you look at it, most of the Baltic smuggling is now actually going through Scandinavian ports into Germany, rather than through the Baltic states. Combination of law enforcement activity, but also just in terms of it's easier to hide things amid much larger flows of goods. And just there are other ports, particularly ports and airports and transit points, which are just that much more active, and therefore it's just easier to use them.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase my question, but something like, does President Trump's circle understand the Russian social contract system? I don't know how else to phrase it.
Yeah, I'm hard pressed to suggest that President Trump's circle understands much. But especially when we come to the Russians. I mean, you know, obviously of late there's been all the revelations about the Moscow, you know, Trump-Moscow sort of project, and people, you know, claims, oh, we can get Putin on board and so forth, which were amazing, not because I think there's actually any real Kremlin connection there at all, but that demonstrates the extent to which essentially these are people are clueless chancers who just did not understand how Russia operates, and that, you know, you're not going to be able to offer Putin a $50 million penthouse and suddenly he'll say, yes, you can build this tower block or whatever. You know, they almost felt that they were living not even just in the 1990s, but in a caricature of the 1990s, or whatever. So no, I mean, I think I'm struck by how time and again, not just Trump. I mean, as I said, Trump doesn't really understand anything, but even the people around Trump who are meant to be more intellectually gifted, whatever they do understand, it's certainly not Russia. And they also, again, final point I'd make, I mean, part of that social contract is not just that the gangsters are involved, but so is everyone else. If you look, for example, the Veselnitskaya case, this lawyer who sort of allegedly, you know, came along promising dirt, and in fact clearly was trying to actually lobby the Trump campaign beforehand for positive sort of, you know, legislative steps. Now, I don't see Veselnitskaya as in any way a sort of agent of the Russian state. I don't think she was specifically tasked. She's not some kind of KGB asset, deep cover, or anything like that. No, she was one of the political entrepreneurs within the Russian system. This is how the Russian system operates. Putin, you might say, sets broad aspirations, and everyone scrambles to find ways of achieving that, or just advancing that cause. Because if they do, then the Kremlin will smile upon them and life will be good. And therefore you just have lots and lots of these individual political entrepreneurs trying things. If it doesn't work, the Kremlin doesn't care. He didn't put any resources into this. If it does work, the Kremlin says, that's good, we'll take it from here. So, and I mean, I think that notion that in fact any Russian, I don't sound paranoid, but any Russian could be acting as a kind of proxy agent of the state, if not now, in the future, is not something clearly that Trump's circle understood. But as I said, if we really have to start listing the things that Trump's circle don't understand, we're going to be here quite some time. Yeah.
Yes, what do you think will happen to these untouchable gangsters after Putin?
I mean, that's part of it. It's an interesting question, and it's part of a much wider discussion about how do you deal with a kleptocracy? Now, one answer is you just stay a kleptocracy. And, you know, as long as the untouchables still kind of pay their tribute or do whatever, no change. But if we presume that there is some kind of desire for some kind of reform, whether it's immediately post-Putin or 3 presidents down the line, at some point, what do you do with these people who are vastly rich and who achieve their wealth through criminal means? Now, the honest answer is how lovely it would be to say everyone must face justice. The practical answer is Russia's probably going to have to adopt a kind of a year zero approach that says, look, you know, maybe not if you committed murders and things, but if you just stole, well, you just stole. But just don't do it anymore. And maybe I will tax you, you know, if you've got 10 million in the bank, give the state $1 million, and then we'll kind of just sort of treat this as a wash. So, I mean, I think what will almost certainly happen is that the gangsters will be given the chance to buy themselves into legitimate society as long as they surrender their criminal activities. Because if we're honest, that is the process of state building that we have seen across the world. You know, this is something Charles Tilley wrote about, that actually state building and organised crime are very, very similar processes. If you look at the House of Lords in Britain, now, you know, the embodiment of all that is stable and, in theory at least, sort of upstanding in British culture. But, you know, the genesis of that was they happened to be the sort of bandit barons with the longest swords who had to be bought into the system. So I think that's probably what's going to happen, is that some figures will be decided, will be regarded as just too toxic and too beyond redemption. But others will be given the chance to basically legitimise themselves, so long as they accept new rules. And again, I suspect that they probably will be willing to do that, because they're gaining security and legitimacy and so forth in the process. Morally questionable, politically pragmatic.
If I can, 2 questions, please. So the first one is related to the question you asked before. How did you totally figure out all these schematics and so on under the carpet or underground or whatever? And the second one is, I don't remember, a few years ago probably, Putin announced the amnesty of the money, foreign money, as you know. Why those rich people don't come back to Russia?
Well, first of all, I mean, I would love to be able to claim that I have understood all the schematics and things. I mean, we have to have, I mean, although humility doesn't sit very comfortably with me, you know, we have to have a certain amount of humility and realize that we can get quite a few of the details wrong. I mean, to a large extent, the answer is, interestingly, there is a vast amount of information that is known in Russia. This is one of the interesting things. If I go and talk to a gangster in the West, even a Russian gangster, you know, usually in prison, and I always have to say, look, you know, remember, I am not your lawyer, I am not your father confessor. Nothing you tell me can ultimately be kept confidential. I can be required to come and give evidence in a court of law, and I have to say whatever it is. And so usually then they will kind of limit what they tell me. Or else it'll always be a friend, or it'll be about what other people do. Now in Russia, a lot of the people I speak to, because they're secure in their krishas, their protection, they have no problem telling me stuff. There, the problem is actually getting them to shut up, not getting them to talk. And knowing how far that's real and how far that's just boasting. Because again, they know that they are at the moment protected by whoever politician or chief of police they pay off. If their krisha breaks, they've got much more to worry about than just what they happen to have told some smart-ass British professor. So actually, it's amazing how much people will tell you. It's amazing how much is available in Russia, and I mean, the sort of simple answer is spend 30 years doing it. I mean, get to know people who you can go back. I mean, quite often I will have spoken to one person, and I'll think, I'm not sure if I can believe that. So maybe I'll go to a cop I know and say, look, does this sound right? And sometimes they'll say, nah. Or sometimes they'll say, yeah, that's spot on. You know, you just have to triangulate. But as I said, I'm going to get things wrong. Second question. I've totally forgotten what it was. Please.
Why the money from the
Oh,
West not going back
yeah.
to the oligarchs?
Well, because people don't trust the state. Simple as that. You're told, oh, there's an amnesty. And then you bring your money back, and then maybe tomorrow there's, oh no, there's not an amnesty. The way the Putin system works, or one of the ways in which the Putin system works, is it loves everyone to be guilty. It wants everyone to have skeletons in their closet. It wants everyone to have guilty secrets. Because the state is the person who decides whose closet they look into. They want to have an excuse whereby they can crack down on anyone. And so if today you say, yeah, I'm going to take advantage of this amnesty, I illegally smuggled $100 million out of Russia and put it there, but I'm bringing it back to Russia. They'll say, great, well done, good on you. Tomorrow they might say, you stole $100 million. That's disgraceful. You're going to prison now, if that's what they want. I mean, that's what people think. People do not trust this state. And that's why, ironically, the only thing that really gets, I mean, apart from just simply if there's a business reason to do so, the only political thing that gets people moving their money back to Russia is because we force them to do that. Because they might think, well, if it goes back to Russia, it might get stolen by the state. But if it stays in the West, it'll definitely be stealed by the state or sold, sequestered. So I might as well move it. So I think this is the thing. Just people don't trust. People would much rather the money go there. So this guy there, and then. Okay. Oh, sorry. Go right to the back. I'll get back to you.
Thank you. So you have named the Bitcoin current system as one of the signs for the incoming fall of the current Russian regime. Do you think those people can be mobilized by political opposition, which themselves have ties with oligarchs? Thank you.
The honest answer is yes, but this is a system that I think is still very strong and ruthless, if brittle. They will not allow political opposition to mobilize to the point where it becomes a serious threat to the state. I mean, at the moment we have Alexei Navalny very much kind of being the point person. The state allows him to continue. The point at which the state really thought, oh my gosh, this guy's a real threat, is the point at which Navalny is going to be in prison if he's lucky. But on the other hand, I think this state is brittle. I think it lacks kind of resilience in that respect. If there's something that happens as a shock, that's where I think we could see things moving very, very fast. And it's interesting. I once had a conversation with an FSB, Federal Security Service officer, from a region. And I said, well, so what is your job? And he said, and it's interesting that the idiom he used, because he'd been raised in Poland and his parents had been diplomats in Poland. And he said, my job is to make sure that the Russian Lech Wałęsa does not appear in my region. I think there is the fact of sometimes catalytic stuff happens, where suddenly you can have, almost from nowhere, a lot of this protest potential suddenly becoming made realised. So I think that's the way it could happen. I'm not saying it absolutely will, but I'm saying it's not going to happen through a sort of a natural, organic, today we got 20% of the vote, next year we might get 30%, and then maybe in a few years' time we'll win an election. Putin is not, and Putin's system is not going out by elections. But on the other hand, if there was some disaster, I mean, if Putin suddenly died and there was a crisis within the leadership, if there was another Chernobyl, if there was some, I mean, the big economic nightmare is a massive default of one regional budget, which would then knock on to a whole bunch of other regions, and suddenly people are just not being paid and such like. If one of these crises happened, then I think we could see a lot of this pent-up protest potential suddenly becoming manifest. But the interesting thing is, we have no idea around which pole. Would it, not as in capital P pole, should I? Is it going to be a Navalny figure, who, for all his limitations, is essentially liberal and Western-looking? Is it going to be some ultranationalist? Is it going to be a new generation communist? There are all kinds of different potentials, and we and the Kremlin have no idea who that person could be.
My question actually very much similar to the previous one. I just want you to elaborate a little bit more about that post-Soviet space or Russian population, about their criminal mentality, because you know they have formed up during 4 or 5 generations that criminal atmosphere, and it interpenetrated in all levels of society, into the culture, into the movies, everywhere, and everyone who has some Soviet past probably they understand Fenya, you know, the criminal language and so on. So, do you really think that the Russian population are able to change their political course towards the West in case that of shock or something like that? Or do you think it is possible only in some very, very successful characteristics will fell together and in long term?
I mean, it will be long. I mean, again, I think we could see a shock creating, you might say, a government that feels it has to make better relationships with the West. Because let's be perfectly honest, this current crisis in East-West relations does not do Russia any good at all. And particularly, you know, in the longer term, you know, they need Western investment, they need Western technology, not even if just simply to exploit their own oil and gas fields and the high north and such like. It does not make sense for them to be at daggers drawn with the West. Yeah, this is essentially emotional. Exactly.
You know,
this is an emotional, generational thing. But I mean, again, I think we could see in the next political generation saying, why do this? But that's a political thing. That's different from actually everyone suddenly internalising Western rule of law values and so forth. And we have to be honest, when we talk about Western rule of law values, are we talking Sweden or Italy? Are we talking Denmark or Bulgaria? I mean, I think, you know, we have to be realistic that I think Russia's going to be Bulgaria before it's Sweden. And it's going to take a while.
Even Italy is not reachable to Russia.
Well, interesting, but you say this, I mean, I think that's, I remember reading some stuff that came out of the early 1970s, which said that Italians have lived under this state of criminality and weak states for so long that it's basically sort of almost encoded in their DNA. And you know, it's going to take multiple generations before that'll change. And yes, I mean, Italy still has a serious problem, but I mean, Italy has made massive strides from then. Likewise, you can find writings that basically say, you know, particularly interwar writings, that say the Germans are by nature so militaristic that, you know, how could that possibly change?
Japanese, the same.
The same. I mean, so actually, I think that, yes, these cultural factors are important, and particularly, you know, again, yeah, you look at Russian TV, you listen to the fact that, you know, everyone's listening to chanson and whatever. I mean, yes, there is a certain sort of difference, but, you know, we shouldn't assume that that somehow encodes itself on
the problem, sir, with all your explanations or examples is that, for example, Japanese or Germans, they draw really good conclusions on what they did. And Russians are proud of that, what they did. They are proud of that most famous saying that "Умом Россию не понять" and so on. So they don't go to that conclusions. The population and the government as well. So that's why
I can answer a question. Japanese and German, the same South Korean examples. 50 years of American occupation.
This is
troops inside, and that's it. And you will change the Russian mindset.
External power.
Before we go into my advocating 50 years of Russian occupation, I mean, but I think the important thing is this. Look, actually, you know, human beings, Russians and everyone else, I mean, are able to, I think, disconnect to an extent their own experiences and realizing how that actually impacts on their life. I mean, yes, of course, you know, the Russians have been through this extraordinary experience, particularly, you know, when the Gulag system meant that, you know, pretty much every family had people who went through the Gulag system, and even if they were purely innocent and so forth, but they were exposed to that culture, they were oppressed by Vory and by Suki, they came back humming chanson and such like, and that has continued. And you can still see it in popular culture. But in some ways, for that very reason, I think people are actually quite aware of the downsides. And I think that, you know, if one looks at surveys of Russians, not when they're asked questions like, do you trust Putin? Which obviously has gone down, but still is always very high. But if you ask them that question like, well, what kind of Russia do you want for your kids? And it's really striking because the things they actually emphasise are precisely, you can set up a business without it being stolen from under you. that you aren't going to be victimized by officials, that there's a sort of freedom of opportunity. Very quickly you see that what they are describing is precisely the kind of values that we have internalized within Europe. I mean, I think that Russia is slowly, painfully coming back to Europe. And, Putin and his regime is, in my opinion, when in 100 years' time history books are written, will be considered to be a transitional period. He is in some ways the last gasp of Homo Sovieticus, in my opinion. Now, there is a post-Sovieticus. I mean, nothing changes dramatically. All of these will take time to shift. But nonetheless, I think we have to be very careful about somehow assuming that, well, Russians, that's in their bones, because, the same way as, frankly, organised crime was so deeply ingrained in both, not just Italy, but also Japan, and yet they're able to turn against it. Now, yes, patience, yes, you.
Within political activists and analysts from Russia, so I have two questions also. So the first about Italy. Can you tell something about how Italian civil society fight against corruption? It's first question, because I think it's very good experience for like example. And the other question is about mostly about experts. Everybody in Europe understands that Italy has some problem with Mafia. Everybody knows about Cosa Nostra, about Camorra, Drangheta and others, but nobody knows about, for example, Tambovskaya, Sonsovskaya, Podolskaya, and so on. So
I remember.
A few people know about that. So it's the question: why, how Italy fight with Italian civil society fight against this mafia and mafia problems in mafia state? And the second, why foreign European experts don't understand some situation in Russia and don't think seriously about Russian mafia and Russian mafia growth?
Well, I'll answer the second one first, but it's easiest, because not enough of them have read my book. That is the clear answer. No, but joking apart, it's because...
Of course, it was film Mafia and Michel Lane books, but it's...
Yeah.
I don't know why.
But because it's not easy to study. There has been good scholarship. Federico Varese brilliant book on the Russian mafia, very much a sort of case in point. So there is some scholarship, but the point is it's hard. It's not just a sort of a language issue, it's because it takes a lot of deep research. It's not something that you can easily sort of pick up. I think that's been one of the problems. But also, precisely because of the way it operates with the state, it's much less visible. This is not the 1990s, when basically, you walk down a street in Moscow and you would see, gold-chained guys and the big Mercedes or whatever. Yes, there's a little bit of that sometimes, particularly out in the provinces. But on the whole, it's become much more sort of submerged within the system, so it's not visible enough. But no, but the main point is they should all read my book. But going back to the point about the Italians, I think it's interesting, and obviously it's different in the sense of because Italy is, or was before, however imperfectly, a democracy. But the interesting, I would say civil society, there were two useful lessons that came from them. One is that actually they did what they could, despite the fact that there were actually often historically poor relations, to build relations with the law enforcement community. Now again, in the Russian context that might sound perverse and bizarre, but actually if one looks at, for example, the way the Carabinieri, the Italian sort of paramilitary police, who've been doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the fight against the Mafia, their relationship with civil society, especially on the left, in the 1970s and early 80s, was appallingly bad. But nonetheless, people actually persisted and took time to actually say, look, we can be on the same side. It was really hard and lengthy, but it actually paid off in the end, because the point is then you actually began to get kind of alliances across the board or whatever. And it's quite interesting that, one can see a few signs of attempts to do that in the Russian context, most recently with Navalny's expose of Zolotov, in which you're saying to the Russian National Guard, who are after all the head crackers in chief, saying, look, you're being stolen from by your own boss. But the second, and I think perhaps more kind of useful thing, is actually solidarity. Social solidarity is crucial. Organised crime tends to be powerful because it atomizes societies and makes everyone individually worried. It's just like the Russians like dealing with European countries on a bilateral basis, because then they can bully more easily. Well, so too, organised crime likes dealing with, an individual shopkeeper, an individual, in whatever context. And actually what civil society did was precisely to try and build bonds of solidarity within communities that up to now had been preyed on by organised crime, particularly in Sicily and so forth. And again, slow, difficult progress. But when people realise that actually, if you threaten someone, you're not just threatening someone, you will have the whole street or the whole village coming out and saying, no, this is not acceptable. Well, very few gangsters are willing to commit mass murder. It's one thing to go and intimidate one person if need be, smash up their shop and smash up their face. But when you've got 100 people staring down at you, are you really going to think, right, let's go get some boys and some machine guns? Because that elevates it to a totally different level. And often organised crime actually backs down. And so again, I think these are the kind of ways, it's actually getting people used to the idea that they need to care about their neighbour. And that in fact, in unity, there is a degree of protection. And that's something that actually civil society did quite effectively, on a very sort of micro level, exactly, in terms of a street, a neighbourhood, or a village. And I think that's potentially a lesson that can be learned. Now look, I'm happy, as any good academic, I'm always happy with the sound of my own voice. And I'm happy to continue answering whatever questions are around. I just want to check with the organisers. Are we fine for time?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay, fine. So
2 questions.
Two questions and there's 3 hands up or whatever. Well, yeah. And then
Short question. You mentioned that you are quite optimistic, speaking about future and so on and so forth. And it was mentioned several times. Italy, wherever, could be Germany. But still, when you are looking at that romantic period of creation of those nations, and Giuseppe Garibaldi did all that stuff, and then it was something different, fascist and Nazi state. And I see a lot of similarities now in current Russia. How optimistic you are about this part of the life in Russia in the next 10 years, let's say, probably after Putin, or in time of end of Putin?
Yeah, well, there's always a sort of difficulty with using the F word because it becomes very, very sort of politicised. But fascism of the Italian variety actually does have distinct kind of connections with what we see now in Sweden, particularly this notion of a mobilisation state, tutto per lo Stato, everything for the state. I think one can see similarities. But again, I think that what we're seeing is the reason that the Putinist state is having to be so repressive, is having to draw on so many resources, is actually a sign not of strength but of weakness. The same reason why it uses vast amounts of propaganda to try and convince Russians that the West is actually so debauched and evil and hostile. Well, you only have to do that if actually Russians naturally are not going to be believing that. And you have to keep trying to kind of reassert and re-whip them up. The point is, this kind of a model of mobilisation state does not last, cannot last. It depends on a new threat, a new excitement, a constantly new spectacle. Now, I do not believe that Putin is an irrational individual. I think he is, I think he's deeply misinformed, I think he's deeply prejudiced, and he clearly is thinking about his kind of place in history. And he's trying to build that. But I don't think he's insane. And I don't think there's any chance that we're going to see him being at all willing to actually have an open conflict with the West, or indeed with most other countries. There are no more Crimeas lying around for sort of easy, quick foreign policy victories.
Belarus?
No one wants, but the point is, Belarus, no Russian sitting there thinking, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we had Belarus? Quite the opposite. Your average Russian is going to be thinking, great, another bunch of people whose roads we're going to have to build and everything else before we do our own. Whether that's true or not is another question. There is no popular enthusiasm for Belarus any more than, northern Kazakhstan with its Russian population or whatever. This is what I mean. Crimea was unique. It was something that all Russians believed was rightfully theirs. It was there for the taking, but let's not sort of more broadly universalise. So we have a regime that is constantly trying to kind of whip people up. with really nothing much to whip them up, because it offers them so little else. The old Putin legitimating narrative was, you just obey, but in return your life will get better and your kids will have an even better life than that. Now it's harder and harder to actually sustain that. You know, people don't believe that, people feel quite the opposite, rightly. And therefore Putin has to say, you're under threat. The West hates you. The West hates Russia. And therefore you need a strong protector, like me. Which has only a limited amount of mileage. You can only claim that there's a threat just over the horizon for so long before people just get tired of it, and before it gets threadbare. But as I say, I think more to the point, I don't think even most of the elite buy that or are interested in that. There is Putin, there is a handful of people around Putin, some of whom believe it, some of whom are even more hawkish than Putin, and some of whom just go along with it because they're doing very well out of the status quo. But I'm struck by how fed up so many people, it's not just ordinary Russians, it's also rich Russians and powerful Russians. I mean, can't say I hobnob with them, but I do know people who are in that set, and who say actually that people are generally tired. So I think this is not something that I can see sort of continually replicated. Yes?
What prevents Lenin's body from being buried normally?
It will fall apart.
Vory.
Honestly, I mean, I think because...
There is no place for Lenin in this land.
I think because Putin's a coward. And this is the funny thing,
Yes,
he has
he's
this
really
great...
coward.
There is this great myth of Putin, the macho, bare-chested adventurer. Actually, if you look at him, he's very, very timid, very risk-averse. He moves when he thinks he knows the outcome. Now, he may often get it wrong, such as in the case of the Donbass, but generally speaking, he actually is quite timid. When you have seen real sort of moments for leadership, Kursk disaster, when Kadyrov's men killed Boris Nemtsov, what does Putin tend to do? His trademark move, he hides to avoid actually having to make a decision. Now, I think he fears that if he did do that, it would galvanize the communists. And although, you know, you look at people like Zyuganov as frankly rather kind of pathetic figures who've long since sold their party cards for just a sort of place as the kind of loyal opposition. I mean, there is a fear that somehow the Communist Party, which retains the only national political machine that is independent of the Kremlin, actually could become a threat, because you have a new generation of people who have joined and so forth. So I don't think it would happen. I think he could go without any trouble. But I think because he's not sure, his default is to do nothing. Anyway, I said two questions, but I think Rank has its privilege. Do you want to ask
Okay, thank you. Sure. Actually, your analysis was very interesting, and I think you made us all, you know, to look to Russia from outside in. But at the same time, I think we have a problem because the mode of change, which was taking place in Russia during the transition years, you know, Sukas taking over, you know, etc., etc. I mean, it was also the place where we were not like outside, observers of this. I mean, we're participants. All the society here was part of this, the whole mishmash. And how you would say, the society here was different in terms of transition, because when you look, for example, at the structure of economy, ownership, etc., is basically like in Russia, I would say, from many points of view. So all these state-protected businesses, like 70–80% of big businesses, they made fortune just because the state protected them, etc., etc., etc. So I would like to get your comment, on methodology side.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Lithuania, but the thing that strikes me... in some ways, what you are describing is precisely the kind of post-stage 1 reform of Russia. I mean, exactly, that yes, you still have essentially an economy that is still dominated by people who made their money and took it in perhaps questionable ways. But now they are operating within a rule of law environment. That things that they could do perhaps in 1992, they can't do in 2019. And therefore that actually kind of constrain them, and therefore it's part of the slow transitional process. I mean, look, we cannot get away from the massive impact of being part of the European Union. Not because the European Union is the answer to all problems or whatever, but precisely because it creates, first of all, huge incentives to operating in certain ways. You know, you be a good boy or a good girl, and all these goodies can be yours from free traffic, free movement, etc. And at the same time, certain sort of major disincentives. Well, if you start, again, if one looks at, for example, what's happened in your neighbours, the Latvian banking system, which for so long has been such a shocking scandal, is now slowly, painfully, but successfully being reformed. And in part, that's actually precisely because of a confluence of the sticks and the carrots that European Union membership is part of. I mean, there are also other factors. So, I mean, this is it. In some ways, you could hold yourselves up as examples to the Russians saying, see, if you do it right, you could be Lithuania. It seems to be a suitable note on which to end. So thank you all very much.